It was just past noon when Marcus stepped off the construction site and into the midday sun, the dust from the morning's work clinging to his boots and jeans. His hoodie, faded from too many washes, clung to his back, damp with sweat. He was hungry, tired, and in need of a moment to breathe. Across the street, nestled between two high-rise office buildings, stood a restaurant he had passed dozens of times. Sleek, elegant, and always full of people in suits. It wasn't his usual kind of place, but something in him wanted to walk in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the hunger gnawing at him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the part of him that still wanted to believe he could exist in any space without question. As he approached the restaurant, he noticed the large glass windows gleaming in the sunlight, the neat placement of wine bottles behind the bar, the uniformed staff gliding between tables like they were part of some delicate performance. The maitre d' stood just inside the entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning each guest with mechanical precision. The moment Marcus opened the door, the change in atmosphere was palpable. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but there was a noticeable shift. Heads turned. A woman in pearls gave him a quick once-over and turned away with a slight wrinkle of her nose. The maitre d' took a half-step forward, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flicked over Marcus's clothes, dusty boots, a worn sweatshirt, and roughened hands that had clearly been working. Without waiting to be greeted, Marcus looked around and pointed toward an empty table near the window. The sunlight hit it just right, making the tableware sparkle. It looked like a quiet place to sit and think, maybe even plan the rest of his afternoon. But before he could take a step toward it, the maitre d' shifted to block his path. Behind Marcus, the door hissed shut, trapping him in that uncomfortable silence, the kind that doesn't scream, but hums with disapproval. He felt the tension build slowly, like invisible strings being pulled taut around him. A waiter walking by gave him a side glance, and a couple sitting near the entrance exchanged quiet words behind their menus. It wasn't just about the clothes. It was never just about the clothes. There was a familiar edge to the air, the one Marcus had felt since he was a kid in department stores, or when he walked alone down certain neighborhoods late at night. It was the feeling of being watched, measured, and found lacking without a single word exchanged. The maitre d's mouth moved, his expression polite but cold. Marcus didn't hear the words at first. He didn't need to. He already knew what was being said. Still, he nodded slightly and stepped back. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But then he saw it. The way the man's hand subtly gestured toward the door, the stiffness in his stance, the faint smugness behind the eyes. And the final proof. Another guest entered, this one wearing sneakers and a rumpled sports jacket, laughing into his phone. The maitre d' smiled widely at him, welcomed him by name, and led him to the very same table Marcus had looked at moments earlier. He stood there for a second too long. Not out of confusion, but out of habit. The kind of habit born from years of swallowing it. Every quiet dismissal, every forced smile, every moment where dignity had to make way for survival. He was used to turning away. He had done it in banks, in boardrooms, at fundraisers, in places where his presence was always questioned first and accepted second, if at all. There was a numbness to it, a rehearsed indifference that shielded him from the deeper sting. As he stepped out of the restaurant and back onto the sidewalk, the sun felt harsher, the city louder. A few people looked his way as he passed, none of them knowing what had just occurred, none of them caring. He found himself staring at his reflection in a nearby shop window. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a millionaire. He didn't look like a man who had built 3 companies from scratch, who had sat across from investors and lawyers and city officials. All they saw was a man in dusty clothes. And that was all they needed to see. The street traffic moved around him in a blur. Cars honking, people talking, the rhythmic beat of a crosswalk countdown echoing faintly in the distance. He didn't feel anger, not yet. What he felt was a cold kind of clarity, the kind that settled deep in the chest and didn't need to scream to be heard. He knew that this moment would sit with him. He wouldn't forget the looks, the tone, the assumption that he didn't belong. He wouldn't forget the way the maitre d' had stepped in front of him like a security gate, all polished charm and quiet judgment. He walked further down the street, his pace steady, hands deep in his hoodie pocket. People passed him without notice. In a world where appearances dictated worth, he was invisible in that moment. But invisibility had its advantages. It meant people showed their true selves without caution. It meant masks slipped faster. And today, he had seen enough to know exactly what kind of people ran that restaurant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, showing missed calls, unread emails, meeting reminders. He scrolled until he found the message from earlier that morning. A confirmation of transfer, a document signed and sealed. The restaurant, the one that had just dismissed him like he was nothing, would soon be his. Not as a customer, not as a guest, as the owner. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just kept walking because he knew the story wasn't over yet. He knew the next time he stepped into that building, the ground would shift beneath their feet. The looks would change. The voices would falter. And the people who had pushed him out would have no idea how close they had come to bowing before the very man they had deemed unworthy. The next morning came quietly. Rain tapped lightly against Marcus's windows as he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, untouched. He stared at the screen of his laptop, where the final closing documents were waiting for his signature. The transaction had been prepared over weeks of quiet negotiation. The current owners, a pair of middle-aged restaurateurs from Connecticut, had no idea who the buyer really was. They only knew the investment firm handling the deal, a front Marcus had set up years ago for exactly these kinds of acquisitions. He'd kept everything impersonal, clinical. It was easier that way, cleaner. But now, in light of what had happened, it felt different. He clicked through the documents slowly, reading every line even though he knew them by heart. The legal jargon didn't distract him. He could still see the maitre d's face from yesterday, that blank, polished expression trying to mask disdain. He could still feel the heat rising in his chest, not from rage, but from the quiet betrayal that came when people assumed your worth based on what you wore, how you looked, the color of your skin. He had worked too long, too hard, to have moments like that still pierce him. And yet they did. Not because he needed validation, but because he remembered being 15 years old, sitting outside a closed diner with his mother in the rain, after being told they weren't what the place was looking for. He had never forgotten that day. He had never forgotten how his mother had held his hand tighter, telling him it was okay, even when her voice trembled. That moment had planted something deep inside him, a quiet fire. And over the years, every insult, every dismissal, every cold glance had been fuel. Now, decades later, that fire burned hot enough to reshape entire blocks of the city if he wanted to. He pressed his finger to the trackpad and signed. The screen flickered briefly. The deal was done. Later that day, Marcus met with his operations manager, a sharply dressed woman named Elise who had been with him since the early days of his second company. She was efficient, smart, and ruthless when needed. When he told her what happened at the restaurant, she didn't ask why he hadn't revealed himself. She already knew. "I want the staff to remain in place for now," Marcus said, watching the city blur past the car window. "Let them keep doing what they do. No changes yet. But schedule an inspection for next week. A quiet one." Elise nodded, taking notes on her tablet. She didn't comment on the strategy. She didn't need to. She understood Marcus's way of doing things. He didn't make noise, he made impact. That evening, the restaurant operated as usual. The maitre d' stood at the entrance, smiling at every well-dressed guest. The staff joked quietly in the back about the man from yesterday, mimicking his voice, his clothes, his confusion. They didn't know their names were already listed in a document under pending review. They didn't know the man they had laughed at had full control of their contracts, their future employment, the very bricks that held the building upright. They thought they had erased him in one glance, but they had only summoned a storm they couldn't see coming. Across town, Marcus sat in a dimly lit office in one of his towers overlooking the city. He didn't feel satisfaction. Not yet. What he felt was inevitability. Like the tick of a clock before midnight. Change was coming, not as revenge, but as a reminder. Respect should never be conditional. 2 days later, the weather broke. Clear skies stretched above the city as the wind moved gently between buildings. It was late afternoon when Marcus stepped out of a black SUV a block away from the restaurant. This time, he wore the same dusty boots, the same faded hoodie, the same weary look that he knew people couldn't help but judge. His hair was unkempt, his expression neutral, and his hands were shoved in his pockets like any man coming off a long shift. He wanted everything to feel exactly as it had the first time. Familiar. He walked the same sidewalk, passed the same boutiques and luxury spas, ignored the same glances from people dressed in suits and heels. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. As he neared the restaurant, he paused. Through the window, he could see the maitre d', smiling as always, greeting a woman in a cocktail dress. The dining room looked exactly as it had before, chandeliers sparkling, waiters bustling quietly, guests sipping wine and talking in low tones. He opened the door and stepped inside. It took only a second for recognition to flicker in the maitre d's eyes. He stiffened. His smile faltered for just a moment before it snapped back into place as if glued on. He took a quick glance down at Marcus's clothes, then back up at his face. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, uncertain. But the training kicked in, and with it came the same tone, the same barrier of polite dismissal. "I'm sorry," he began, already positioning himself to intercept. "We're Before he could finish, a woman appeared beside Marcus, Elise, dressed in sharp black with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her heels clicked once against the marble floor, sharp and final. "Mr. Gray is here for the final walkthrough," she said, her voice calm, clear, and authoritative. A silence fell. A waiter dropped a spoon in the background. A man at a nearby table looked over his glasses. The maitre d' blinked. "A walkthrough," he repeated, voice smaller now. "Yes," she replied without looking at him. "Mr. Gray will be assuming operational control today. This restaurant, as of this morning, is under new ownership." Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words. He walked past the maitre d' without another glance, moving through the room slowly, observing, absorbing. Guests turned to look. Staff froze in place. The moment had landed like a stone in still water. In the back office, papers were already laid out. Keys were handed over. Elise managed the formalities. Marcus stood by the window, watching the sun stretch across the polished floors. The maitre d' remained near the entrance, his posture now tight, uncertain. He glanced toward Marcus but couldn't hold his gaze. He didn't speak. Neither did Marcus. When the documents were signed, Elise turned to Marcus. "Would you like to speak to the staff?" He shook his head. "Not yet." That evening, the restaurant opened as usual. But the air had changed. Staff whispered. The maitre d' was quieter than usual. No one joked. No one laughed about poorly dressed men. There was a new name on the office door now, and though it was written in the same gold lettering as before, it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. And Marcus? He went home, removed his boots, and sat alone in the quiet of his living room. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. It wasn't revenge. It was a lesson. One that had just begun. The next few days passed in a curious silence. Marcus kept his distance, allowing the restaurant to operate normally under its new ownership while Elise conducted her evaluations. There was something poetic about letting the place breathe under the pressure of the unknown. The staff knew something had changed, but not how much. Rumors began to circulate that the restaurant had been bought by an investment group, that they were being watched, that layoffs were imminent. Whispers floated through the kitchen and slipped between the waitstaff, finding their way to the maitre d', who now stood at the front with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. Marcus returned on a Friday evening, just as the dinner rush began. This time he entered through the back door, not to sneak in but to observe. He walked slowly through the service corridors, unnoticed for a moment. The kitchen buzzed with organized chaos, chefs shouting times, servers moving in and out with plates, a dishwasher singing faintly to himself. Marcus leaned against a wall and watched. No one paid him any attention, assuming he was just another delivery guy or maybe a maintenance tech. It gave him time to study them, not out of malice, but curiosity. Who were these people when they thought no one important was looking? He moved toward the office where Elise was already waiting. She handed him a small binder of notes, internal reports, observations, behavior summaries. There were no immediate plans to fire anyone. Marcus had no interest in revenge by default. What he cared about was accountability. The maitre d's report, however, was extensive. There were patterns, discrimination complaints that had quietly been filed and ignored, a habit of turning away patrons who didn't look the part, condescension towards staff members from different backgrounds. It was worse than he'd imagined. Elise closed the folder and looked up. "It's your call." Marcus stood there for a moment, binder in hand. He thought about the choices ahead. Public dismissal? Quiet termination? A meeting with the staff? None of it felt right. None of it felt enough. Then it hit him. They didn't need to hear a speech or be taught a lesson from behind a desk. They needed to see. He stepped out of the office and into the front of the house. He walked into the dining area unannounced. The maitre d' noticed him immediately and stiffened. There were no words exchanged. Marcus simply walked to the same table near the window where he had once been denied. He pulled out a chair and sat down. The room fell quiet. A waiter approached, nervous, unsure what to do. Marcus gestured to the menu. "I'll have whatever the chef recommends." The waiter nodded and scurried off. Around him, the restaurant moved like a broken machine, unsure how to function. Guests whispered. Employees froze. The maitre d' stood like a statue at the front, sweating beneath his collar. And then, as if in slow motion, Elise entered. She walked straight to the maitre d', looked him in the eye, and handed him a white envelope. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. He looked inside, pale. There were no words. He nodded stiffly, removed his name tag, and walked out through the main entrance, his steps slow and deliberate, eyes cast to the floor. No one clapped. No one laughed. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was simply the end of a chapter written by his own hand. Marcus sat at the table in silence, sipping water. The waiter returned with a plate of food, simple, beautifully arranged, made with care. Marcus took a bite, then smiled faintly. It wasn't about the meal. It was about presence. Occupying a space that was once denied. Not through force, not through vengeance, but through quiet ownership. Through becoming the kind of man who no longer had to raise his voice to be heard. The kind of man who didn't just earn a seat at the table. He built the table. That night, he stayed until closing. Staff approached him quietly, some out of curiosity, others with soft apologies in their eyes. He accepted none of it and rejected none of it. He wasn't there to shame them. He was there to be seen, to exist, to stand in the light of their judgment and remain whole. When the last light dimmed and the door locked behind him, Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk, the city quiet under the night sky. A breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. He looked up at the restaurant's sign, its lettering elegant and glowing under the street lamp. Tomorrow the sign would change. Not the name, but the meaning behind it. Tomorrow it would stand for something else. He slipped his hands into his hoodie and walked away into the night, leaving behind a silence more powerful than any roar. The next morning began with headlines. Small ones, tucked in the city section of a few digital outlets, but headlines nonetheless. Luxury restaurant changes hands overnight. One read. Another offered more curiosity than clarity. New owner shakes up local fine dining scene. No names were mentioned, just speculation. In the tight circles of business gossip, however, the whispers moved faster. Some already knew who Marcus was. Others, who had overlooked him for years, were now scrambling to remember every conversation they'd had with him. He had always kept a low profile, avoiding interviews and red carpets. Not because he feared attention, but because he valued peace over spectacle. By noon, the restaurant's team had gathered for a staff-wide meeting. Elise stood at the front, poised and precise as always, laying out new protocols, introducing interim managers, and answering questions with just enough detail to calm nerves. Marcus didn't attend the meeting. He stayed upstairs, watching from a quiet office as the room filled with employees. Some uncertain, some defensive, others simply curious. There were no speeches, no dramatic reveals. Just structure, order, a sense that things were going to be different now, not worse, just different. After the meeting, he took a walk through the neighborhood, moving past boutiques and coffee shops, cutting through streets he hadn't visited in years. Everything felt both familiar and distant, like returning to an old home that still bore the echoes of who he used to be. He passed a bus stop where a teenage version of himself had once waited in the rain, clutching a folder of college brochures he couldn't afford. He passed the corner store where he'd filled out job applications, knowing no one there would call him back. He stopped by a small bookstore where, once upon a time, a clerk had followed him through every aisle, pretending to tidy the shelves. None of those places knew who he was now, and maybe that was the point. The world had changed, or perhaps he had simply changed within it. But what struck him most was that despite all he had built, the way people saw him still hadn't shifted until they were forced to look closer. Success hadn't rewritten their bias. It had only interrupted it. Later that day, he sat for an interview not with a major publication, but with a local nonprofit media group that focused on equity in business. The interviewer, a young black woman named Risa, asked him about the purchase, about the restaurant, about the viral clip from a customer's phone that had started making rounds on social media. The maitre d' turning him away, the quiet standoff at the table days later, the envelope. He didn't flinch. He explained what happened in simple terms. No anger, no dramatic flair, just facts. He told her that owning the restaurant was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming space, about proving, mostly to himself, that he didn't have to wear a suit or carry a briefcase to be treated with respect. He spoke about his mother, her sacrifices, and the quiet lessons she gave him when the world refused to see her. Risa asked him what he would say to people who accused him of making an example of the staff. Marcus paused for a long moment before answering. "I didn't make an example of anyone," he said. "I gave them a mirror. What they do with that reflection is up to them." The interview ended on that note. The clip of his words went viral that evening, flooding timelines, sparking debates. Some praised him for his restraint, his message. Others called it performative, questioned his motives. But Marcus didn't engage. He had said what needed to be said. Nothing more. That night, the restaurant was quieter than usual. The buzz hadn't quite returned. Some guests came out of curiosity, others out of support. A few regulars didn't return at all. Marcus sat in the office, reviewing renovation proposals. Not to change the place's aesthetic, but to shift its energy. He wanted to expand the kitchen, add mentorship programs, source ingredients from black-owned farms and urban growers, host youth culinary workshops, not because it would look good on paper, but because the world didn't change unless someone made space for it. He stepped out briefly into the dining room, unnoticed this time. The new maitre d', a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, greeted a guest with warmth and ease. A young black server carried plates confidently between tables. The music had changed too, no longer classical piano, but subtle jazz with roots deeper than the building's foundation. He watched them for a few minutes, not to judge, just to feel, to understand whether the space was finally beginning to reflect something closer to truth. And as he stood there, it struck him. Not a moment of victory, but of alignment. This wasn't about one restaurant. It was about claiming a seat at a table long built to exclude, and then reshaping that table so others never had to knock the same way he did. He didn't want applause. He wanted change. And this, however small, was a start. The first month passed slowly, like winter thawing into spring. The restaurant settled into its new rhythm, each day peeling away the layers of its old identity. The staff learned quickly. Those who stayed did so because they understood the shift wasn't just cosmetic. There were new expectations, new standards, but also new possibilities. For the first time, suggestions were welcomed from the bottom up. Voices that had gone unheard now held space. The fear that had once lived behind polite smiles was beginning to disappear, replaced by something steadier. Respect, maybe even pride. Marcus never announced himself as the owner. His name was never added to the website. He didn't pose for photos or host a grand reopening. He let the restaurant speak for itself. The people who came now did so because they had heard things were different. Not louder, not flashier, just more honest. Word spread slowly through neighborhood talks, local blogs, quiet posts online. The energy inside had changed and people noticed. One evening, Marcus returned to the restaurant just as the dinner rush was ending. The lights were dimmed low, casting soft shadows on the walls. Laughter hummed gently across the room. It wasn't the polished hush of high society anymore. It was real, textured, layered. Tables weren't just full, they felt alive. He sat at a quiet table near the back, unrecognized as usual, and watched. A couple in their early 20s, dressed casually, was seated not far from him. The woman wore a hoodie and jeans. The man had paint on his fingers. They spoke softly between bites, heads close, grinning at something private. A table over, a grandmother shared dessert with her grandson. Two businessmen in polos, not suits, toasted something unseen. The place no longer curated exclusivity. It welcomed humanity. From his seat, Marcus could see the plaque mounted near the front of the restaurant. Elise had insisted it be placed there, and he hadn't objected. It was subtle, engraved with only a short quote and no names. Everyone has a place. Everyone has value. Simple, quiet, true. He remembered how far that sentiment had been from reality only weeks before. How easily the illusion of class and culture could be used to divide. How judgment disguised as standards had kept people out. But here now something was changing, and for once he could feel it without needing to force it. He thought about his mother again, how she used to hum old soul songs while cooking dinner in their tiny apartment, how she made every meal feel like a holiday even when the fridge was nearly empty. She had taught him that dignity wasn't given by others, it was something you carried even when no one recognized it. Especially then. He looked around the room one last time and stood. As he passed through the kitchen, he paused. One of the younger chefs, barely 19, looked up from a prep station and nodded at him with a flicker of recognition, not of status, but of presence. Marcus returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Outside, the city was quiet, wrapped in dusk. Streetlights blinked on one by one as he walked down the block. The wind tugged gently at his coat. Behind him, the restaurant glowed softly, a beacon not of luxury but of inclusion. A place once marked by closed doors now stood open. He didn't need to look back. There would be more like it one day. More buildings to reclaim. More spaces to rewrite. More rooms to walk into without needing to prove a thing. He knew what they had once said, people like him didn't belong there. But now they'd have to say something else. That place belongs to him. And it always did. They just didn't see it yet.